thank you all for being here today. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. So when Jessica contacted me and asked if I was available to do this, I immediately said absolutely yes. And then wanted to know who was my audience going to be, and it sounds like there's a pretty big variety. So my understanding is some of you are health professionals who are now in retirement. Others of you are community members. Many of you are probably parents of children who either are teenagers now or will be teenagers or have been teenagers. I've still got one teenager. I have a 25-year-old, a 23-year-old, and an 18-year-old. So I'm going to join the ranks of the empty nesters in 2 weeks, which I am. People look at me and ask me if I'm worried about that transition. I'm actually very excited. There seems to be that developmental thing that happens where they kind of, your relationship evolves to a point where everybody's kind of pretty glad that you're going to be away from each other for a little while. So, and then I know that with the older two, they come back home and it's never the same as it was when they were there when they were little, but your home is always home. So it's good to have them there, and it's nice to have them launched. So in preparation for this, I was thinking a lot about kind of how to make this hopefully interesting to everybody. My plan is to give you a little bit of information at the beginning, not too many statistics or anything, but just some general information that I think will help to give us a foundation. And then I really would like to open it up to your questions and your concerns. I hope that we can generate some conversation and some, talk about this important topic. And then make sure that we also visit, and I'd like to include at the end, I may leave a few minutes to talk about, and it could come up before that, what are we doing here at Concord Hospital, what are we doing over at the Family Health Center to take care of our teenagers and some of these issues that we're dealing with. So if that doesn't come up elsewhere, I'll make sure that we leave room for that. So last night, as I was putting my thoughts together finally, I was letting my niece and nephew, who are twins, 10 and a half years old, are visiting from Salt Lake City this summer for several weeks. And my niece said to me, "Can you practice? Would you talk to us a little bit about what you're gonna, and that way you'll know what you're saying tomorrow, and we can give you some feedback." So I jumped on that chance and didn't think they would be particularly interested in a lot of the statistics, but I opened it up, and one of my cousin's other 10-year-olds, so I have 3 10-and-a-half-year-olds. And I said to them, so part of what I'm talking about is teenagers and their emotions and their mental health. So I said, do you guys have any idea, what do teenagers get stressed out about? And their answers were bullying, anxiety, and school. I was like, you guys you're on top of it. They know what is stressing teenagers out. And then, more sadly, each of the 3 of them proceeded to give me an example of how they had endured bullying over the last period of time, the last couple of school years. And that made me realize, wow, we're all a relatively normal family, not in any stress around transportation or food insecurity or other issues, not socioeconomically depressed or anything, and yet your kids who all 3 of them had stories of how they had been bullied. And then we talked a little bit about how that affects them in their relationships. So I think that made me realize one of the really important things is just opening up conversations with our teenagers is such an important thing. And I think sometimes we think about teenagers and they certainly do tend to spend more time in their room and more time alone and kind of isolate themselves. But if we open ourselves up to the possibility of being curious with them and just asking them about things in their life and what is stressing them out, they don't like to answer questions often about how was your day at school or how much homework do you have to do. But if we can open up that conversation to just let them know that we're interested in how things are going for them, often many of them are really very open to letting us know about those things. So we do, if you are worried about our teenagers, there is in fact good reason to think, wow, many of them are struggling. We do know that about 6 million teenagers in any sort of the prevalence of teenagers being anxious, because about 6 million kids in the course of a year will have a diagnosis of anxiety disorder. That's about 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 teenagers between the ages of 12 and 17. And slightly fewer than that, about 4 million will have depressive episodes. That means they've had like some incident in the last year for about 2 weeks where they've struggled with having a lousy mood or not being interested in stuff that they're usually interested in, and having 4 other symptoms of depression. So there are a lot of kids out there who are struggling with anxiety and depression. Depression used to be more common. Anxiety is now superseded depression as a big issue in adolescence. And so we've actually had some things put into place in the last several years as it was recognized that we were struggling more, teenagers were struggling more with depression. There have been screening tools that are being put into place now. We try to screen all teenagers over the age of 12, at the age of 12 and 22 for depression. And we've started implementing that actually at the Family Health Center. And we don't really screen them for anxiety. And so in preparing, and I sort of never really thought about that until I was preparing for this talk. And I realized, wow, that's probably something I need to take back to my team and that we need to be thinking about, since anxiety is now also a major issue for kids, that we need to be thinking about screening for that too. Screening for substance use, obviously, is another thing that we're concerned about, because teenagerhood and adolescence is often where people start their use of substances, whether it's tobacco or pot or alcohol or other things. And so we also do have in place screening procedures to be able to ask kids about their use of alcohol, tobacco, things like that. So those 3 things that my niece and nephew and cousin's son identified, those are certainly things that teenagers are struggling with. We know that in this day and age, in the last probably 10 years, certainly since most of us in this room were teenagers, there is a much greater, what some people label as sort of hyper connectedness. And certainly the technology and the various things that have come along, kids are much more kind of focused on being connected with each other, and that, although that can have a really positive impact, we also know that that creates a huge amount of stress in kids' lives. So here, my niece and nephew, and so none of these 3 kids have phones or Facebook account or anything like that yet. And so part of our conversation was also, so what do you think will happen when you have a Facebook account? And my 10.5-year-old nephew said, I don't like that stuff. I'm never going to be on Facebook anyway. I don't care about that stuff, or Instagram. That stuff's all stupid. And his twin sister said, yeah, you say that now, but when you're 13 or 14 or 15 and all your friends have a Facebook account and Instagram, I wonder if you're going to still be able to say that, or whether it will be a lot of pressure to be on there and to be connecting with people and to be liked, to have your picture liked and to have this thing liked. And we talked about the fact that stress for us, I certainly had my share of negative interactions with peers when I was little, but when I would go home, the people that I would hang out with would be my friends in the neighborhood, and we would run around until dinner and come home. And now, because the kids are so connected or on Facebook and Instagram and all these things, that stress continues after they've left school and the school day is over. And so they talk about that as being, you have this, I learned like one new acronym a week, I feel like. So about 6 months ago, somebody had written out FOMO, F-O-M-O. Who knows what that is? Yeah.
Fear of missing out.
Fear of missing out. I don't know what that was. That was my list. So fear of missing out. These guys live in a constant state of, I'm going to miss out on whatever the next thing is. I'm going to miss out on how come Susie and John posted a picture at this place, I wasn't invited, people didn't include me. So there's that, really feeling that constant kind of worry about feeling left out. They clearly acknowledge that although parents and other adults are putting some pressure on them, many of them have grown up in this way that they also put a lot of stress on themselves about how they look and how they perform at school and elsewhere. So, and we have all become a much more anxious society. So our environment is kind of, has become very anxious. I mean, I think probably many of us in this room may have grown up when we were younger. It was fine. Like, we would leave the house and you'd be gone, and we didn't have cell phones, so that nobody was really checking in on us, but somehow we would make it back home for dinner and everything would be okay. And people are much more anxious about letting their kids go out places, and those parents who aren't anxious and who are bucking those trends face a different kind of anxiety, because there's now a much sort of, the environment is around, well, that's not, you can't let your 8-year-old or 10-year-old go to the playground by themselves. They have to have supervision. So it's kind of this feedback loop that has escalated into a place where we're more anxious, our kids are more anxious, we're all more watchful, we're all kind of a little more hypervigilant. And so I think, it's a combination of factors about why kids are struggling in this way. And certainly there are, the statistics, probably all are aware of this, unfortunately we do have young people who are taking their own lives. Suicide has become it used to be the third most common cause of death in 18 to 24-year-olds, it's now second. And the quickest rising group is the 11 to 14-year-olds.
Yep.
Which is really, really a tough statistic to see. Somehow we've got to intervene and try to help these kids and identify the kids who need our help. Thoughts, questions? Stop for a second. Yeah?
How early does it begin? So the idea being we have to help these kids, but by the time they've already reached this point of being anxious and stressed and whatever, how early does it begin that we can help them?
Good question. So I think this is where we're starting to, our already stressed out teachers and school systems, we're starting to try to implement mental health first aid teaching in the schools, and helping teachers and guidance counselors to be able to work to identify which kids are at risk. And one of the things that we've started to pay attention to is related to this pyramid. You don't have to be able to read it, it's more of a reminder for me. But this pyramid is based on a study that was done way back in the mid-1990s, 1995 to 1997, and it involved 17,000 youth. And then they followed them to see whether they had, how their health was over the course of time. And what we found out was ultimately the pyramid ends up here where it says early death, and before that is increased disease and disability, adopting of health risk behaviors, social, cognitive, and emotional impairment, and then disrupted neurodevelopment. Does anybody know what goes down here that leads to all these issues? So, anxiety. What comes down here at the beginning of it was looking at adverse childhood experiences. So ACEs. Has anybody ever heard that before? Okay. So what they found out was they administered a questionnaire to people to see how many adverse childhood experiences they had. And the kinds of experiences were things like, did a parent or other adult in your household often or very often swear at you, insult you? Did a parent or other adult push, grab, or slap you? Did an adult or person touch you or fondle you? Did you ever feel like you weren't loved? Did your parents argue? Did you ever lose a parent through abandonment or a divorce? Did you witness violence. So it turns out that if you answer yes to 4 of those questions, your risk for a huge number of both emotional and medical issues like skyrockets. And the kinds of things we're talking about are things like your risk for obesity and your risk for heart disease and all kinds of health concerns. And so finally, I'm not quite sure why it took so long, but finally the medical system has started to understand we better go back and pay attention to this and try to identify early on which people have been exposed to these adverse experiences, and then try to make some interventions to try to work on preventing some of these top things in the pyramid. So we should be able to, relatively early on, start to identify these. The other thing that's happening in schools, I have several friends who are involved in special education, and they're starting to do workshops on what's called trauma-informed work. And so, we spent a long time, I think it was great, I'm not saying it wasn't good, teachers started to learn more about identifying kids who had attentional issues and like ADHD and learning disorders. But the thing that we may have missed was that problems with attention and behavior can be caused by a lot of different things. And I think there's been, to some degree, rightly so, some accusation of medical personnel that everybody was getting sort of over-medicated and treated with stimulants for what was getting identified as ADHD. And I think the thing that I have to say about that is that I think people's intentions were good, in that I think always people in our profession are trying to help children to be able to function better. And what we knew at the time was that we had better evidence that, in fact, the most important treatment and the most effective treatment for young people that do have ADHD is medication. And so people were trying to do that. But what we may have not been as savvy about, or what some people may not have been as savvy about, was to also explore what other things may be contributing to those issues with hyperactivity and inattention. And we've certainly learned now through some work like the American Academy of Pediatrics is working very hard to help people to understand that limiting screen time is something that helps children to be able to learn to focus, that giving them all those simulation of sitting in front of videos or playing with video games and stuff, that we know that can have an impact on neurodevelopment and can affect kids' attention. And so there are recommendations coming out about that. But trauma and early exposure to domestic violence or to any kind of trauma is also something that certainly can impact kids' attention and concentration. And so having teachers learn about those kinds of things and be able to recognize when students are being triggered, for instance, in the classroom, or how they're reacting in certain situations, can be so important to the teachers being able to then meet those kids' needs. And again, if we can have that impact early on in elementary school, then when they get to middle school and high school and the academic stresses are higher, we've helped them to learn some of those coping strategies. I mean, I'm one of those people that I'm very concerned about the fact that we put so much stress on kids to be reading and writing and doing all those things in preschool and in kindergarten, when we're not necessarily spending as much time helping them to learn their social skills. And how do I recognize when Johnny's angry about something, and what do I say to Johnny when Johnny gets angry, or when we're fighting over something? How do we resolve that conflict? And I think part of what we're seeing in the older kids in middle school and high school is they've not had as much of a chance to play and to be guided by adults in terms of learning some of those social skills. And it's much easier for us to have an impact on kids and those social skills and help to guide them and provide some different frameworks when they're younger. When they get older, they're not quite as receptive to that anymore, but they're dealing with the fallout from what we have failed to allow them to learn and teach them. And I'm not I'm not trying to be judgmental because I understand that those teachers and as parents, there are a lot of different pressures now than there were, and people are on waiting lists to get into private kindergartens or first grades or wherever they're going, or making sure that their kids have the best advantage that they can. So I'm not trying to judge that, but I'm just saying I think that may be part of the fabric in which these kids are developing some of the issues that we're seeing.
Thank you for being here. 4 children, almost the same age, 16 to 23. So kind of started, I saw the social media, thinking, and I just heard this recently, and I think it's true for all age groups, Instagram equals envy. I think it's one of those silent things where kids, if they're not posting, they're scrolling, they're seeing what other people are doing and they're not included in. And that even goes for adults too. Sometimes people maybe after dinner and you're not in that invitation. And it's addictive for kids because there's beautiful photographs and things maybe they want to look at, but then they also scroll through and they see what they're not included in. And they're afraid to post, they don't feel good about themselves because they won't get enough likes. How is a parent, and there's so many things, different directions to go to with this, but how is a parent to equip your kids with the tools to say, well, put blinders on and don't go, and don't, look through that. When even, most colleges, universities, and schools and coaches are posting stuff. It's a really silent, difficult thing I see to kind of tell your kids not to be part of it. What kind of tools do you tell adolescents who are struggling with it, but they're maybe not going to share that with you? It's not this big issue. It's a silent one that they're looking at 24/7 almost on their feed.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I don't have one single answer for that, but I think that there are some things that we can all do, and it was one of the things that I was kind of thinking about last night and looking at different places. I mean, I think that yes, you're right that they're not going to be necessarily telling you about it, but I think it is important for us. We have the possibility of setting a good example, and although many of us in this room may not be on Instagram, I'm going to guess how many people in this room have a smartphone? So the vast majority of us, even those who are, weren't around, were around for many years before there were any kind of portable phone devices, now have those. And the kids complain, on some recent surveys that were done, the kids complain that the number one thing that they're frustrated with their parents about is how much time their parents spend on their devices and how they don't engage with them. So setting an example for our kids and articulating what we're doing, like my sister-in-law is so good with this. She'll say to the kids, all right, I'm gonna go check this on my phone. I'm gonna take a few minutes and do this. And then 10 minutes later, she'll say, all right, I'm plugging in my phone. I'm finding I'm getting sucked into Facebook. I'm gonna go do something else. I'm gonna go pick up my book and go read. So she's not saying to them, no, you can't do this or whatever, but she is constantly narrating her disciplinary behavior. And she'll say to them, you know what, we came out here for vacation. I'm going off Facebook for 6 weeks while I'm here. And I found in a conversation the other day that one of our cousins had posted a picture of her kids like jumping into something. And I said, oh, did you see the picture of, Danielle posted of the kids jumping into the water hole? And we said, nope, I haven't been on Facebook. She said, yeah, it's one of the things I miss, but you know what? It's also been really nice because I feel like I've had more time on my hands. And her kids, I guarantee you, they're listening to their mother say those things. So that's one thing we can do. The other thing is, it's hard because it's so hard to know what they're seeing, and this is one of the things I've struggled with my boys, because they grew up in this time of using things and was how much, adolescence is a time where they want and need some more privacy away from us, and they also count on us to still be monitoring and making sure that they're making good decisions. And so I think that, what I found is that varies tremendously from one family to another. What are the rules, or what are the consequences, or what are some families, there's a definite sense of like, at 9 p.m. your phone gets plugged in my room and you don't get it until tomorrow morning. And that's true, like the parents, but they're, like everybody, like our phones live here when we all go up to our rooms. In other families, their kids take their phone, parents take everybody like takes their phone into their room, and it's, so some parents I know check their kids' stuff. I think in terms of having those, I think it's important to have those conversations about taking breaks from social media, like it's okay. I just was talking to a woman this morning about how she was noticing that as she had been listening to the news more recently, that she's become increasingly anxious. And so she said, you know what, I'm going to listen to the news in the morning and watch the news in the evening, and I'm not going to be looking at the news all during the day. So I think helping our kids to identify how they're feeling and what their reactions are to what's happening online. Because some kids are able to be more like, yeah, whatever, Susie's doing this, Joe's doing, like they really don't seem as affected by it. And other kids are much more affected. Even within my 3 kids, there are significant differences between each of them about what kind of upsets them and what sucks them in.
I think it can be devastating. And the other side of that is the Snapchat, where if you're getting photos from someone and then all of a sudden they stop, it's almost like a break in your friendship.
Right.
And they don't talk.
Yeah, and so that's the other, is they make assumptions, and that's the other thing that I talk to teenagers a lot about, is they often, like many of us, when we're anxious about something, we go to the worst case scenario, right? That's where our brain goes. That's anxiety. So that unknown triggers all of that sort of escalation of anxiety. And so helping them to also remember that there may be a myriad of reasons why that person is not answering them or not. They may have like something happen at home and their parents said to them, you didn't take out the trash, that's it, your phone is mine. And now they don't have their phone to answer anything, and there are going to be some friends who are going to be like, Susie's not even answering me. I've texted her 7 times and she didn't even answer me. So helping kids to remember to communicate with each other openly and teaching them how to do that, about they're not good at addressing conflict anymore, because like you were sort of alluding to, they're not resolving things in they're not having those face-to-face conversations. So again, as the adults, if we can help them, and when we're having conflicts with our kids, work on kind of face-to-face, how do we talk about something that we may disagree about, or if you've done something that makes me upset or angry, how can we have a conversation about that? How do we address these things? Because they're addressing them a lot of times, and I'm sure most of you have, if you use your cell phones, when somebody texts you, it is not easy to figure out what the emotional content of that is. And you can misunderstand it, you can misread it, you can think that a very short response means they're upset with you, when a very short response may mean I'm running out of the door to get to a doctor's appointment, or I'm late for work, so I can't answer that. So again, there's a lot of assumptions that happen and a lot of in the head stuff that happens that is so potentially detrimental to us and to our kids. So I think part of it, and once the cat's out of the bag, it's a little bit harder to do, but I think what I often try to do, and I think we have to do more and more, is like with the 10-year-olds, the 9-year-olds, the 10-year-olds, we have to work on establishing those guidelines and giving some guidance to them before they're in the middle of all of it, right? So the the middle schoolers that are the ones where we need to be kind of working on how we give them the skills to think about using computers. And technology are a wonderful thing. I mean, it is incredible how much more information is available to us. But like anything, it's only as good as the tools that we have and the skills that we have to use that information. Otherwise, it can be overwhelming, it can be inaccurate, it can be all those different things. So, I think part of it is helping to prepare them for that way of doing things. Yes.
You talked about screening for depression, which I've personally witnessed. My daughter's 12, and her last appointment, she was asked if you've been sad, that kind of thing. What do you think the screening will look like or sound like for anxiety?
So there actually is, there are a couple of different scales that we can use that are validated in kids. One of them has, I think, about maybe 30 questions or 35 questions and actually screens for a lot of different types of anxiety. There's one that we use in adults that's just 7 questions that looks at what we call generalized anxiety. So that's the GAD-7. And actually, so we do screen a lot of adults with that. We just haven't gotten down to screening the kids as much. So there are some screeners that can be used. There's a revised manifest anxiety scale. It's also another one. That one that I alluded to is called SCARED. I can't remember what it's about all the different anxiety disorders in children. So there are some scales that we can use. It's the dilemma, and I think why sometimes medical practices are reluctant to screen, or there are a couple of different things, right? So you screen them, and then what do you do once you screen them? And unfortunately, we are, as most people are probably aware, we are in a time when right now there is a shortage of child and adolescent psychiatrists, and it's hard to get in to see mental health providers. I think in this area we're actually relatively lucky, and certainly at the Family Health Center we're incredibly lucky. I had several of my colleagues sitting back there, and we have a behavioral health team that is, I don't know, we have probably 15 of us maybe or something like that. So I mean, we do have access at the Family Health Center, and we cover, we have about 18,000 patients who are seen through the Family Health Center, and we have a number of different therapists. We are training social workers and marriage and family therapists, and so we do have some really integrated work. And now through a grant, there is a lot of work being done to get more mental health workers into primary care settings. So I think that we're heading. That's the good news, is that I think the awareness of how much mental health is, how prominent it is, how common it is, and the primary care providers, how much they're faced with helping people who have both maybe medical issues and mental health issues, is really helping us to see that the way that this is going to be able to be addressed is to have people within the primary care settings who can work together. And so that's part of what we're working on here. And I think that will happen. We have a great, Riverbend has a wonderful children's program. I have several, there are 2 child and adolescent psychiatrists over there who are really good. And they are great. And so I think we do have access to that. My husband's a pediatrician, and I can tell you he feels like I didn't sign up for this sometimes. When he trained in pediatrics in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we were not, that's not what they were. I mean, as you heard, I trained in pediatrics and in psychiatry, but in our pediatric training, we were not necessarily learning a lot about children's mental health issues at that time. So this is a steep learning curve for all the primary care providers, the pediatricians and the family practice docs, to start to learn how to do this. And I've done several all-day workshops with Dr. Sarah Walsh, who's over at Riverbend, to try to invite the family medicine docs and the pediatricians in, and we've held an all-day seminar where we work with them around some of the mental health issues. So I think we are trying to address it. It's just a big issue. Yes?
Well, and it sounds like a lot of what you're addressing is with the kids themselves, where a lot of this where it's starting from seems to be like a home environment. Is there anything being done that way? There's only so much teachers can do.
Yes.
And if it's not being followed up at home, you know, pediatricians can only do so much, but again, if it's not being taught or, you know,
Yeah.
in the home environment level, then we don't have the follow-up. Is there
Well,
any?
I mean, I think we're trying to, certainly there are lots of things going on in the home environment, and, one of the things that we haven't really touched on today is the whole substance use and opiate crisis and all of that, and certainly, kids are being hugely affected by that, and so addressing the substance use issues that we have within the state and the addiction issues is also happening through that same grant, working on trying to address some of those issues. I think one of the ways that we also try to do it is that we try to recommend when people are engaging in treatment that we focus not just on the child, but that we broaden it to be involving the whole family, because like you say, it does involve the whole family. And often if there are, one thing that we also know is depression and anxiety run in families. So often if kids are showing up with anxiety issues and depression, it's usually like a multi-factored kind of thing, and one of the factors is that genetic vulnerability that they may have inherited from one of their parents. So we know that these things kind of run in families, and so you can only imagine if you have a depressed mother who's unable to care for the child, or a father who is exceedingly anxious and maybe using alcohol to try to deal with that, that it's a kind of a double whammy, because they already have that genetic vulnerability, and then the environment kind of makes that even, exacerbates that even worse. So yes, we absolutely need to include families. And the other thing that we're learning is that that peer support is something that especially adolescents are really open to. And so there have been some really exciting new programs in the high schools, especially, where kids who feel like they want to try to help their colleagues and are interested in it, they get training in mental health first aid and in how to support a friend or a peer who has like thoughts of suicide. And we obviously don't expect those, it's not that we're asking those teenagers to be like a mental health provider, but what they've shown in the studies is that kids sometimes are more willing to talk to other kids or to go to other kids as a first line. And so these peer support kids are identified and known in the school as people that you could go to if you were struggling with this. And they have adult mentors, the guidance counselors, and some other adults who are involved who help. But these are programs I think Concord High School has started to implement, and a couple of the other high schools in the area. So that's, to me, that's also really exciting, because I think, again, I was talking last night, my sister-in-law and I, neither one of us could remember that anybody would have ever admitted to another teenager that they were feeling depressed or anything like that when we were teenagers. I never knew of anybody who was depressed. And now kids, the good news is they are more aware of and more willing to talk about this stuff with each other, and kids will self-identify. That's part of my, that's my anxiety. When I get anxious, this happens. Or, yeah, I really was depressed last year and I had to go see a counselor. They're willing to let people know they're seeing counselors. They're willing, so the environment in which they're growing up, they seem to be, as a generation, more open to talking about it. And so I think we as the adults need to also try to destigmatize getting help for these issues.
It's also interesting though, where the line is. I mean, I absolutely totally get that there's, a lot more anxiety and depression, but some of it in my mind is, yeah, you're nervous about the first day of school. It's the first day of school. You should be. Then all of a sudden it's I'm anxious. It's my anxiety. Mm-hmm. Where do we help define what's just absolutely normal behavior?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, I agree with you, and I think again that a little bit goes back to what we were talking about before about teaching kids coping strategies, is helping people to understand anxiety is a natural reaction to things that are to stress in the environment. And so absolutely helping them to distinguish between everybody gets anxious before the first day of school, and so what can we do to help you to manage that, and helping to normalize some of that is another thing that I think you're right, we may be falling down on the job a little bit, because there's sort of, I mean, again, I think that feeds down, even when we see adults, there are adults who, have had to deal with multiple stresses in their life, but they still feel like if you could just write that prescription for them and so that they don't have to feel anxious, that would make everything all better, instead of feeling like I need to learn how to cope with this. And again, that's multifactorial. I mean, there's direct, pharmaceutical to you advertising about, talk to your doctor if you have this, that, and the other thing, because if you're not sleeping, you could be having butterflies flying out of your head, and you have a very peaceful night's sleep. Just ask your doctor to write this prescription. And it doesn't say anything about like, well, did you drink alcohol or caffeine, or what are the other things that disrupt sleep? Did you exercise today? So I think the hard part is those 30-second commercials are very focused and put out an impression out there that like, oh, just, we should just be there should be a pill for everything to take. So you're right, we also need to really focus on the coping skills. Again, I'm really heartened to see, I know a half a dozen teachers who are in their classroom when things start to get unwound. They are having the kids do mindfulness in their classroom. That to me is really hopeful, because mindfulness is one of the things that now there's a lot of evidence out there that can be really helpful. We should all be, I engage in mindfulness at my desk when after I've seen a patient. That is that process of just helping yourself to just be focused in the moment, to try to shut things out and to learn. And kids are very good at it. They're actually really, really good at it. So if we can help our teens and preteens learn how to be mindful, how to recognize what am I noticing right now about what my brain is doing, about what my body is doing, what will help me to calm down, what do I need to do? Can I just take a few slow, deep breaths, which we know will make your diaphragm go down. It's like, pushing down hard, like when you're going to the bathroom, if you Valsalva, you slow your heart rate down. You can slow your breathing down. That does an incredible amount for you, so that then you can kind of reset yourself and be ready for whatever the next thing is. So, yes.
I just had a question, kind of going back to the, I have 13-year-old twins, boy and a girl at home, and they're great and I love them, and so I'm trying to teach and guide with some tools outside of the social media world. They don't have social media, but they do have phones. We don't use phones, we put them in a basket at night, but I have good friends who are friends of mine who have a 13-year-old daughter, and they're just constantly monitoring her, monitoring. I'm trying to teach mine privacy and trust, and you have a phone that I have access to at all times, but I'm not at night scrolling through to see what you said all day long. I have a parent, a very close parent who scrolls through her phone and then is asking me, oh, so-and-so said this about this, and I'm like, you're a 40-year-old woman. Like, you've got to get yourself under control here. Like, what are you teaching your 13-year-old? There's no guidance on privacy. There's no trust. I have no doubt that my children probably say things they shouldn't say once in a while, and I probably haven't seen it, but I would hope when I do see it, it will be addressed at that moment. So I'm really struggling as a parent how to talk to that other parent, because I'm not saying my way is better, but it's different. And now the kids are like, oh, well, your mother reads your phone? Like, that's what's going on now. The kids are like, oh, well, our parents don't read our phone.
Yeah.
So it's really a hard balance.
Yeah, my go-to line about that is every family is different, and you know, there are gonna be different things, people eat different things, some people, we never had soda in our house, my kids, you know, when they went over to somebody else's house, I'm not gonna try to control them over there, but we just never, and their kids actually, it was always kind of a joke, because like, special treat was to get those San Pellegrino, you know, so when the kids had a party, all their friends knew, like, if they were at our house, what you were gonna get was San Pellegrino. That was the big treat. And they all knew, like, you can't drink or drug at that house, because you're out. And the one time it happened, the kid self-selected and called his mother to pick him up. It was funny. So I think, again, it's hard. I don't know how close you are to this other parent. I encourage people to have conversations with parents. Hopefully not in the presence of the kids, because I think that's the other thing that I see that happens sometimes is parents start talking with each other about stuff that really their 6-year-olds or 8-year-olds or even 10-year-olds shouldn't be. And I think part of that, we still need, and we're still struggling a little with this notion of sort of how to be a parent and understand that that doesn't mean you're going to be your kid's best friend kind of thing. Yes, you want them to come to you with issues, but there are a lot of parents in my generation and sort of that, I would say like the 35 to 55-ish year old, where we really were sort of pushed to be close to our kids and almost like be friends with them as opposed to being their parent. And I think there's more of an understanding now, again, that like there's a difference between being a parent and being a friend. And you can be a confidant to your kid, but you also they count on us to set some rules and to help guide them around those things. So, I mean, if you can have a conversation, you know, that can help both sides to understand the other person. I'm sure you're right, and I think knowing that our kids are going to make mistakes and they are going to say things, and again, so part of that is rather than like, you know, if they make a mistake and they say something that's hurtful or gets out there, rather than being angry with them and punishing them right away, it's like, how did that happen? You know, like, let's go back and figure out how did that happen that you got so upset that you did that? Was it that you didn't give yourself time to cool down before you answered it? Was it, what could you have done differently? You know, trying to brainstorm those things, because it is a time they're going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. We all say things we shouldn't say or do things we shouldn't do. And so, I mean, teenager, that's part of their time of life and their time of, you know, doing some risk taking, figuring things out. I mean, it's hard because the stakes are really high in some ways. And, you know, if they decide to take a risk on trying an opiate and it has fentanyl in it, it could be a deathly experiment, right? So I think that's what we as parents are faced with worrying about, is that like the stakes feel really high sometimes. But if we can take a deep breath and find those other opportunities where maybe we know the stakes aren't that high and we can let them take risks and see what happens when they take risks and what those consequences are, then they can begin to feel more confident in their decision making and know that when they mess up, they have somebody they can go to be like, I messed up, and what do I do? I mean, my now 25-year-old, and he knows I use this story, so he's given me permission. But it was before he was 21, I think he was like 20, and he had gone over to somebody's house pretty far away, and he started to drive home and he realized he shouldn't be driving home. And he called me and he said, Mom, I can't drive, I need you to come get me. I'm like, absolutely, I'll be right there. So it's having those conversations so they know. I mean, he knows I wasn't happy about that behavior, but the agreement we had was, if you're ever in a place where you're worried about the person who's driving you home or you don't feel, call me, no questions asked, I'll come and get you. We'll deal with the other stuff later. I mean, if we can help them to know when you mess up, there are also people who are there who can be there. Yes?
Uber, just one good
Uber.
side of technology.
Yeah.
College students,
It's
drinking
so-
and driving, don't worry so much. So one great thing about
It
technology.
is great.
But maybe, I'm hoping maybe you can just finish up with, what's your outlook with these numbers that you kind of told us about, the millions suffering? So what is your outlook in the future? This is our generation that'll be, you know, working in a workplace setting, taking care of people maybe in a medical setting, you know, doing all kinds of jobs out there. Do you think that this group, you know, going the long road with treatment, with, self-identifying, that this group of individuals, millions, are going to get that help or kind of grow through what they need to be successful in their job settings?
I hope
Do you
so.
have
The good news is their brains keep developing until they're about 25 years old. So even, and my boys, believe me, they needed all of that. My 25-year-old needed that extra 7 years. But now I feel like that frontal lobe is fully myelinated and he's on his way. So, they do, the good news is they do, even once they get through adolescence, they still have some more maturity to do. I'm an optimist by nature, so I am very hopeful. I think that the awareness has been raised, and I'll finish with this as being, I think, a hopeful sign. So this was a campaign that started 2 years ago called Change Direction. Has anybody in this room seen those posters? Okay. So this was an effort, and actually in our state, Judge Broderick was one of the major forces behind getting the word out. You may or may not know his story. He has a son who was severely mentally ill, and they had not identified that. And Judge Broderick always said, I'd be the first one to admit I was completely ignorant. I had no idea what the signs were. I had no idea. If somebody had let me know what the signs were, if I had been aware of that, we might have been able to get him help sooner, and maybe things would have gone the way they did. So this is a national campaign, but I think it appeals to, it's tried to be appealing to the generation that uses emojis. I don't feel like these are the most descriptive emojis, to be honest, but I feel like it is a hook to try to get in that younger generation. And Justice Broderick and other people who were on that committee went out to schools to try to help educate. So I think I'm hopeful because I think kids are starting to be educated about both looking at for themselves and looking at patterns in their peers, identifying when their friends where they are feeling uncharacteristically agitated, where they have sudden or gradual changes in behavior, where they're not taking care of themselves, where they're withdrawing and isolating, or they're feeling hopeless. And that if they see those signs in themselves or in other people, rather than waiting and waiting and waiting, one of the messages is get help. If it's only a little problem now, it's going to be a lot easier to intervene and help with that little problem. Once it grows, if we let it fester and it becomes a bigger problem, it's more complicated to try to manage. So I think that early identification and all of us just being aware, that's the other thing I say to parents, it's not a one behavior thing. It's not like your kid broke curfew last Friday and now that's it, you need to take them to go get help. It's seeing a pattern over time that makes you more concerned. Wow, compared to last fall when they were playing on the soccer team and hanging out with their friends on Friday and Saturday, all of a sudden now their grades have dropped and they're in their room and they don't want to join us for dinner and they just seem more grumpy. That's more worrisome when you see that pattern. Everybody has a bad day. They're gonna, they fail a test, they do whatever, they have a bad day. Again, working on how do I bounce back? What are those skills? Helping them to build skills of resilience, I think, is part of the key. There was a great New York Times thing about talking about a study where they showed that one of the things that's really helpful in parenting is when we not only share stories of our youth, but when we share stories of adversity and how we overcame them. These are your family stories of when people struggled, and this is how they overcame that struggle. So again, it's not about having failure and feeling like that knocks you down. It's about how does that failure then help you to build resilience so that you can move forward.
Resilience, and I'm a psychotherapist here in town, and more and more I see the kids just really self-regulate. They need to learn how to do that, whether it's depression, anxiety, anger. But to share a little vignette, I have a young granddaughter, and at 2.5, I watched her playing with her elder cousin who was 4. They had an argument, and I watched my 2.5-year-old granddaughter regulate herself by using hand and tiger. She came to me and said, it's a little softness thing. What is it? When I'm so angry, I want to roar. She roars. I take a deep breath. She takes a deep breath and count to 4. She counts to 4.
How awesome is that?
That at 2.5 years old. I'm thinking, yes, this is what we teach your kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We are going to get angry. We are going to be upset. We're going to fail. We're going to have these negative things. And I think for a while there, we were sort of feeling like we could just only push that away, and we just want our kids to be happy and whatever. And it's like, oh, okay, that's great. And they have to learn how to deal with all that other stuff that, that they're going to face. We can't protect them from every negative thing in the world.
So my son's favorite book, although it might not have been his favorite book, but I read it to him every single night regardless, was How Are You Peeling? And it was a book with vegetables, and we could identify how he felt that day at the end of the day, so he could describe to me through the vegetables that had feelings. It's the best book around. How Are You Peeling? Yeah, I was thinking when he became a teenager, in fact, I threatened, I'm getting that book out again. And we're going to read it every night.
Well, there are definite similarities between about 2.5 and 3-year-old and like the 13 to 15-year-old age. Yeah. So you will feel like you're like, I think I have deja vu. I think I went through this about 10 years ago. Yeah. So the other good news actually is I don't know how many of you are aware. There's a survey, and what's our time like? Do we have 2 minutes?
Sure.
2 minutes. Okay. So the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is, I don't know how many people have heard of that. This is a survey that gets given to high school students across the country. And it tracks behaviors that have to do with safety and have to do with substance use and sexual activity and all those kinds of things. So seatbelt use, so good. Right? Like, how many times did I wear a seatbelt when I was a kid? I mean, it was maybe in my adolescence, we started really, and my mom was a stickler once it did become like a thing, but certainly when we were little, that wasn't something. So seatbelt use, kids are using seatbelts. Yay. Texting while driving is actually getting better. It was like at its worst a few years ago, and it's still not great. Like, it's amazing. 40% of seniors said in the last 30 days they had texted while driving. So
High school
seniors in high school.
Yeah. Senior like me.
Oh yeah. I don't know how many seniors, but seniors in high school. This was not going to school because they felt unsafe. This used to not really be an issue. This means that somewhere, either on their way to school or because they feel unsafe at school, they say they're refusing to go to school. And that number is about 5% of kids across freshmen through seniors. So probably one kid in every 20K classroom is not going to school because they feel unsafe. They're worried about their safety. So it's part of that anxiety kind of thing. Alcohol use is actually going down. Pot use is going down. Not by huge numbers, but it's a definite trend over the last several youth risk behavior surveys. So I think we are, and the harder drugs too. So at least we are making some inroads in terms of helping these kids to make choices to do it later. I know I don't think has it passed? I know there was a movement afoot to try to get cigarette sales moved from 18 to 21. I don't know if that passed or not, but I think they're really trying to, kids. And one thing that was kind of sad to me to read, a different article, not in the YBRS, but is that there are still, I have to look at my numbers because I don't want to misquote it, but in terms of tobacco smoke, although there are fewer kids that are smoking, that the most recent stuff talks about that there are 1 in 13 Americans who are less than 17 years old will die early of smoking-related illness. So it's still, that's like 5 to 6 million. So we're making inroads and helping them to take, but I mean, that's still a lot of kids. Yeah, so any form of like tobacco use. And so that's the other, they're coming out with these, and you're probably aware, like they're the flavored tobacco products and the vaping, and there are all these like trendy things. So we are still struggling with kids. I mean, it's better, but we're struggling to get kids to still, and that's something that, like, there's so much definitive evidence out there that that's not good, good for your health. So it's the general, that's the other thing is just, teenagerhood, and I talked about this with you, it's a time for them to learn healthy patterns of living and of behavior. Sleep, we didn't even talk about sleep, but you can imagine, right, part of the issue also with some of these, the anxiety and depression, kids are not getting an adequate amount of sleep. Some of that is, some of the kids really are staying up really late doing homework because they feel like they have 4 or 5 hours of homework that they have to get done. But a lot of it is also they're just on their devices and stuff like that. And getting an inadequate amount of sleep, I mean, I'm a total grump if I don't get enough sleep. So, we know that it takes a toll on your ability to think, your ability to reason. Your emotions are much harder to control if you're sleep deprived. So that's another area of educating our teenagers about how important sleep is and again, setting examples. I mean, I know I'm bad about it sometimes and I don't get myself in bed as early as I should. And I have to reset and make a distinct effort to say you know what, this can wait till tomorrow. I need to get my sleep. So sleep is another big thing that I think we have done. We can help kids to focus on. Anyway, thank you for such a lively